Hi, I'm Whitney Espich, the CEO of the MIT Alumni Association, and I hope you enjoy this digital production created for alumni and friends like you.
Good afternoon. I'm Rick Lufkin, Chair of the Cardinal and Gray Society. I'd like to extend a welcome today to the Cardinal and Gray members, but also a special welcome to the members of the Emma Rogers Society. Your continued engagement is very much appreciated. This afternoon's program is on the overall subject of climate change. This is part of a four-part program that the Cardinal and Gray is working with in collaboration with the Alumni Association under the umbrella of the Alumni Forum. We started out with a program on innovation and entrepreneurship, proceeded to service. This month, the subject matter is climate change, and next month we will close the program out with the subject of women in leadership. Please feel free to sign up to the Women in Leadership program, which will be on March 31st, and Cardinal and Gray's Covalent program, complementing that, will be on March 28th, and we'll look forward to seeing you then and there. As you are members of Cardinal and Gray, you are welcome always to come to tech reunions. Tech reunions this year will be on May 28th, 27th to 29th. You are welcome to attend every year. Registration materials will be coming out in the next few weeks, sometime in mid-March, and we will be very much looking forward to seeing you in person at the alumni reunions, MIT reunions this May. This afternoon's program is on the subject of climate change, a big tent program, a big tent subject for a big tent subject. We have two MIT professors, speakers today. Professor Jacopo Buongiorno will be joining us from Logan Airport. Thank you, Jacopo. He is the TEPCO Professor of Nuclear Science and Engineering, and he's the Director of the Science and Technology Program at the Nuclear Reactor Laboratory. Hopefully, the technical service from Logan Airport will be serving him well, and we very much appreciate his willingness to make time available out of his busy schedule. Our second speaker will be Professor Paul Joskow. Professor Joskow is a 40-year faculty member of MIT, has also served as the president of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and his principal areas of research have been in industry and regulation, government regulation of industry. You will have the ability to ask questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A box on the screen, and we will endeavor to answer every one. This program will be recorded and will be available on the Cardinal and Gray website in a couple of weeks. Right now, I'd like to pass the baton over to Professor Jacopo Buongiorno, coming to us from Logan Airport. Jacopo, you're on.
Thank you very much, Rick. Can you hear me and see me clearly?
We can see you.
Fantastic. So as Rick mentioned, it's not a particularly ideal situation for me. What happened was that Delta rescheduled the departure time for my flight a few weeks ago, and we couldn't sort of rearrange the program today. So I came to the airport early, and I'm calling you from Terminal A. So again, please bear with me if there is a little bit of background noise, but I think we got the connectivity at least is on target. So I'm going to share some slides here, and we'll go ahead with that. All right, so the title of my brief talk is Nuclear Batteries, a New Way in Energy. So we'll get to the concept of a nuclear battery in a few minutes, but first I want to give a little bit of context. So the desire to decarbonize our economy in many ways is a tide that lifts all boats, where the boats in this analogy are all different low carbon technologies, nuclear being one of them. And there is growing consensus that nuclear can play a significant role in a low carbon world. And it's becoming broader in terms of the different stakeholders that are expressing this support. Let me start from the bottom of this slide. There is at the moment, and there has been actually for a few years, a strong bipartisan support in Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, for maintaining the existing fleet of nuclear reactors and also for growing with advanced technologies such as the ones that I will discuss in this talk. It's interesting, the two parties come to that same position from very different angles. For the Democrats, it's all truly about the desire to use nuclear for its potential to help with the decarbonization effort. For the Republicans, it's more about energy security, business opportunities for nuclear companies, and also the desire to reestablish a leadership of the United States in nuclear technology on a global scale. There are very prominent climatologists that have also made nuclear a central piece of their messaging on how we get to a deeply decarbonized economy, including MIT's own Carrie Emanuel. Captains of industry, very well-known public figures like Bill Gates and others, who have actually invested a significant chunk of their money in new nuclear technology. Gates himself has a nuclear company called TerraPower, which just bagged its first contract here in the United States less than a year ago. And then also interesting, some historically skeptic, nuclear skeptic organizations such as the Union of Concerned Scientists have come out expressing some level of support for nuclear. In the case of UCS, in particular, for the existing fleet, as a way not to lose ground in the decarbonization of the power sector. That's the context. However, the current approach to building new nuclear power plants is economically unattractive in the United States and Western Europe. What is the current approach? For testing and licensing of a new nuclear technology, you're looking at something like a decade. These large machines, gigawatt scale plants, are typically built in a field. So it's a field construction, which tends to be low productivity and fairly inefficient. And when it's all said and done, you spend a few $1 billion, and it takes a decade or half a decade to build a new nuclear power plant. Ultimately, you're connected to the electric grid, which is a commodity market, so it's not a particularly attractive market in which to make money. So the hypothesis here is that the nuclear paradigm for development and deployment has to shift, and it has to shift along three concepts. The first is that these machines have to become smaller, easier to build, so smaller, more serial manufactured, and in particular, shifting from a construction site-based model to a factory-based model. Factories and shipyards tend to be very high productivity environments as opposed to construction sites, which are not. The second is leveraging the exceptionally high safety profile of these new nuclear technologies to basically accelerate the testing and licensing of these new systems. And then lastly, producing also higher added value energy products than electrons, than commodity electrons on the grid. In the next few minutes, I will focus primarily on the first and the third and the first aspects of this paradigm shift. So I'm going to now introduce the concept of a nuclear battery, which is quite simply a very small nuclear reactor. So how small is small? Well, you can see physical scale there, something that would fit roughly within a more or less standard shipping container. In terms of power output, a nuclear reactor is a heat source, so you can get heat directly if that's what the customer requires, or you can use a turbo generator to turn part of that heat into electricity. And the range we're looking at is, let's say, between a few megawatts to a few tens of megawatts. So let's just say nominally 1 to 20 megawatts. It is a nuclear energy source, so it's carbon-free. Unlike larger reactors, all these new machines are designed to be dry cool, which means you don't need to be next to the ocean or a lake or a reservoir or a river to reject the waste heat, according to the second law of thermodynamics. And that provides an additional degree of freedom in terms of siting these machines or these systems in many more locations than traditional plants. It is factory built, entirely factory built, and as I'll show you in the next slide, it basically comes to the site in a series of standard containers, which can then be connected to the user, whether it's a microgrid, or I'll show you in a couple of slides what the typical applications might be, through these plug and play connections. So from the time the nuclear battery arrives to the site to the time you get your heat and or electricity to the customer, it could be a matter of days or a couple of weeks, not months, not years, as with the larger machines. Because of economic constraints, you cannot afford to have dozens of operators on site to maneuver the system. And so these technologies, or these reactors, are designed to essentially operate autonomously with a remote, not a remote control, but a remote monitor. Interestingly, they can run, depending on the design, between 5 and 10 years without any need for refueling. At the end of that period, they have to be refueled, but instead of being refueled on site, they're shipped off, or they're shipped back, I should say, to a central facility where they are open up, defuel, refuel, refurbished, and then either sent back to the same site or to a different site. Part of the logic of calling these batteries is that we envision a fleet model in which you would have hundreds, possibly thousands of these nuclear batteries. They're all identical and interchangeable. So a customer does not need to get unit 1, unit 2, unit 3. They get whatever is available at that time, because they're all the same. The implication of this model is that there is no need for on-site storage and handling of radioactive material, and that obviously helps with acceptance. Just to give you an idea of the footprint compared to other low carbon energy sources, that little green rectangle that you might have actually a hard time seeing on these slides, in these figures, that would be the physical size of a 10 megawatt nuclear battery, and it's compared there to a nominal solar or wind system of 10 megawatts. And of course, with wind and solar, nominal 10 megawatts really means that you're probably going to get 3 or 4, if you're lucky, megawatt on average. So it's really, really tiny, very compact system compared to alternatives. And then the last point that makes it exciting, at least for us here in the US, is that Western suppliers, in particular American suppliers like Westinghouse, BWXT, and X-Energy, are in the leading seat. For the traditional nuclear power plant technologies, the large scale, gigawatt scale technologies, the center of gravity has very much shifted towards East Asia. So the main vendors at the moment on the global scale are the Chinese, the South Koreans, the Russians, and the Indians. The Indians primarily for their domestic markets. Okay, so it's a transportable nuclear power plant or nuclear energy systems, and here you see how this system would be deployed at the site. So it comes essentially in 3 containers plus 1 that is then shipped back. The one on the left is the reactor itself, and it's the heaviest. It's about 100 tons. So this doesn't travel on the back of a semi truck. It travels on the back of a multi-axle truck. Then you have a second container which has the power conversion unit that turns heat into electricity, and then a third that is instrumentation and control. The additional benefit of this model is that if the customer at one point no longer needs this system, as I said, they ship it back, and the site essentially returns to greenfield conditions immediately without any need for additional decommissioning. Okay, so the last aspect that I want to talk about for this particular technology is the added value. How do we create more value for nuclear energy? Added value can come from 1 or 2 approaches. Either there is a strong policy signal that recognizes some unique or very attractive aspects of an energy source. In the case of nuclear, is the fact that it doesn't emit. The local economic impact might be very positive. There is a contribution to energy security. That's all good. It's absolutely possible. I would say with the current administration in the US is even likely, but certainly beyond our control, where our control means beyond the control of engineers that look at technology innovation. The second approach is to capture new markets in which these nuclear products, nuclear energy products, could sell at a premium. And I would submit that within reach with the right technology, and these nuclear batteries that I've been talking about are the right technology. So why does this matter? Because if you're in the business of decarbonizing the global economy, the first thing that we need to realize is that the power grid, which is attracting so much attention at the moment for decarbonization efforts, only accounts for roughly 1/4 of the global emissions. So even if instantaneously today, we did a perfect job and completely decarbonized the power grid. You still have 75% of the CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions to take care of. And those come from sectors like industry, that's factories, chemical plants, chemical processes and things of that type. Transportation, of course, air, land, and water, buildings, and even agriculture. Now, parts of these different sectors can be electrified, in which case you're back to a bigger grid. But most of these sectors are very, very hard to decarbonize. So it's important to have some energy technologies that can actually tackle the emissions in all these different sectors. So again, I would say that nuclear batteries that we're working on are one such potential technology. And the idea would be to co-locate these nuclear batteries with end users, with basically the users of the energy that these nuclear batteries produce. And so you can think very, very broadly across all sectors of the economy. If there is a need for just electricity, things like desalination plants or pumps for flood protection, or a town that needs hydrogen electrolyzers to convert or to decarbonize their transportation sector locally, or data centers, or even new processes for steel, or e-vehicle charging stations, indoor aquaculture, even ship propulsion, etc. You could have nuclear batteries co-located there. But an even bigger market is one where you have both heat and electricity, or in some cases just heat. And so there are some factories and processing plants that require primarily heat. And in that case, again, the co-location of nuclear batteries with these industrial sites would make a ton of sense. The same goes for district heating, military bases, indoor farming, microgrids of all types, and a little bit futuristic also, small nuclear batteries for space installations. The value proposition is that by co-locating these nuclear energy sources with their end users, you're able to largely eliminate the need for massive, costly, and often unreliable infrastructure for energy storage, transmission, and distribution. So this becomes a more distributed energy network, ultimately more resilient, and again, importantly, carbon-free. So this is the last slide I have. At the top, you have an image of a traditional large-scale nuclear power plant. This is one that is currently under construction, Unit 3 in France. Very nice machines. They run reliably. I visited many of them. And in some countries, as I said, China, South Korea, India, Russia, to an extent, it makes sense to continue to build these large machines. But perhaps in Western Europe and the United States, where that traditional model has not worked as well, the future is going to look more like this smaller scale systems that we call nuclear batteries. So let me stop there, and I'm gonna then either give it back to you, Rick, or pass the baton to Professor Josko for the next talk. And I suppose we'll take questions after Paul's presentation.
Thank you, Jacopo. Let me just throw one question at you to get started. You mentioned the concept of heat and generating electricity. What I did not hear in your discussion was, how do you convert the heat into the electricity? Because in a conventional nuclear power plant, of course, there's a huge amount of infrastructure with water cycles and pumps and all of that. Can you give me just a quick summary as to how you do that?
Yeah, so if you recall one of the slides where I showed the 3 or 4 containers that come to the site, the first container is the heat source, it's the reactor itself. The second container is the power conversion unit, and that's fancy words for saying a turbo generator that takes heat from the reactor and converts that part of that heat, because according to the second law of thermodynamics, you cannot do a full conversion, part of that heat to electricity. So it's a compact version of the much larger, you're correct, much larger systems that we're used to in large power plants, whether they're nuclear, natural gas fire, or coal fire. Those are large turbines. This is a system that only produces a few megawatts, so you can get away with something that is a lot compact, that basically fits within a container.
Wow. Okay, thank you. Just one other question. In the world of medical technology, we have something called magnetic resonance imaging, which has been very successful and is used throughout the world. Before it was called magnetic resonance imaging, it was called nuclear magnetic resonance, and it got nowhere because it had the word nuclear in it. I was wondering, have you given any thought to rebranding your nuclear battery to eliminate the word nuclear, just because.
Yeah, I'm always very conflicted when I get this question, given that I spent the past 30 years of my life in the nuclear engineering community. So I actually like the word nuclear, but the question that you bring up is a real one and is a good one. So the short answer is yes. I think not just me, but many others have been thinking on how do you reset the conversation, and I think rebranding is important. So one that I like for these systems is quantum batteries. And the word quantum, of course, means a lot of different things to different people, but the nuclear fission process, which is at the heart of any nuclear fission reactors, is a quantum mechanically enabled process. So from a technical point of view, you could call these quantum systems and it would be, again, technically accurate. So thanks for the question. It's it's not my specialty, but it is an important point.
Branding is important. However, I just want to continue with the flow. Paul, could I turn the baton over to you? And then we will follow up with questions more broadly. You're on, Paul.
Sure. Let me attempt to share my screen. Okay. Okay. I was asked to discuss my research on climate change, and I'm an economist, and the area I've been focused on is decarbonizing the electricity sector, and I'm involved in a number of different projects, which I'll discuss briefly. The first is a interdisciplinary study we're doing at MIT on the economic future of electricity storage in deeply decarbonized electricity systems. The MIT Future of Storage study is, we hope, will be released soon. It involves faculty from and research scientists and graduate students and postdocs from engineering, science, economics, Sloan, and the MIT Energy Initiative. We have been, one of our chapters in the economics is now available as a working paper, as a pre-release on the SSRN, and it will be released tomorrow by the MIT Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research, and with no paywall in front of it. So if you're interested, you can get that. A second area I've been interested in is wholesale electricity markets and how they need to be reformed to accommodate the deep penetration of wind and solar, which, as I'll discuss in a moment, have very different attributes from traditional generating plants. And finally, my third area of research is on transmission expansion to support efficient decarbonization of electricity sectors. Why electricity sectors? Well, decarbonizing the electricity sector is, in an important way, the foundation for decarbonizing the rest of the, or much of the rest of the economy. And the basic strategy is to decarbonize the electricity sector. The states and the current administration have various targets, but the focus is on getting to net zero for electricity generation before 2050. Then we use clean electricity to increase electrification of transportation, buildings, and some industrial applications. As there are a number of different zero carbon generating technologies, hydroelectric, but it's constrained by environmental and public acceptance considerations in terms of expansion. Nuclear, as Jacopo just said, new nuclear plants using the current technologies are challenged by high costs. And then wind and solar, whose costs have been declining dramatically over the last 10 years. In the longer term, there are other possibilities: carbon capture and storage, small modular nuclear plants, as Jacopo has just discussed, green hydrogen, other fuel cycles like the alum cycle, and of course, in the longer run, everyone hopes that fusion will become a practical alternative. Much of the focus in the electricity sector has been on expanding very, very significantly the presence of wind and solar in the electric power system. And wind and solar have a number of attributes that create challenges. First of all, they're intermittent generators. They're driven by weather conditions, wind direction, cloud cover. Obviously, at night it's dark, rather than being something that can be controlled by the system operator based on some kind of economic merit order dispatch. Wind and solar also have near zero marginal operating costs once they're installed. And this has some significant implications for in both the short run and the long run for the design of wholesale markets. In any system that is deeply decarbonized, energy storage is critical for balancing the system and maintaining network reliability. There are several potential technologies with different cost and efficiency attributes, which we're studying in our work. And as I said, it has implications for future wholesale electricity market design and implications for transmission investment. So this is just a picture of the traditional short-run electricity markets built upon dispatchable thermal generation primarily. Generators bid in their marginal operating costs. The wholesale market maker stacks them up from lower costs to higher costs. And as demand moves up and down during the day and from day to day, they march up and down the economic dispatch curve with the system operator calling the lowest cost resources available at any point in time to balance supply and demand reliably. Also, as demand increases for the fairly stable economic dispatch curve, the price goes up. And at these prices, the inframarginal generators are earning economic rents, which is supposed to help to cover their investments. In a wind and solar system, the traditional control the system operator has on supply is not there. As I said, these generation is intermittent. This is a picture of about 12 days in Texas during the blackouts they had in February last year. And as you can see, the wind goes all over the place, as low as 1,000 megawatts of delivery, as high as 1,700. This is based on weather conditions. Similarly, solar varies a lot from day to day. And balancing the system, that is meeting demand, becomes challenging if you don't have either significant fossil generation, which if you're decarbonizing, we're removing, or if you have storage. And this is just another picture. This is in California in August 2020 when they also had blackouts. And here this is wind generation, the blue on August 15th, and the green is wind generation on August the 14th. As you can see, there are significant differences just between 2 days, but there was also a very sudden dip in the wind generation right around 6 o'clock in the afternoon, and that's when they had a blackout for about an hour as the system recovered. On those days as well, this is a picture. This is the gross demand that the system operator in California faced. This is the net demand, which is the demand after wind and solar generation, which is exogenous, is taken into account. And as the system becomes more deeply decarbonized, as is the goal in California, the net demand will get smaller and smaller as fossil generation is retired. But the question is, what are we going to use to balance the system as the sun goes down or as the wind varies? And the answer is, in a system that produces zero carbon emissions, it's going to have to be storage, primarily demand response, and that's pretty much about it. There are many different types of storage technologies that we're studying. I'm not going to go into all of them in any detail. The ones that we know the most about are lithium-ion batteries, which got their start in transportation, but are now being deployed in electric power sectors. and pumped stored hydro, which has been around for a long time, but is also challenged primarily by siting issues for new technologies. How do these technologies vary? Well, they vary in a number of different dimensions. And the dimension that I'm going to just focus on here, the two dimensions are basically the cost of energy, how much energy can be stored, and the cost of capacity or power, how much capacity can it have. And lithium ion with different cost estimates is down here. It's actually pretty expensive for storing energy. It's less expensive for providing power, and it's ideally suited for relatively short durations of storage before the energy runs out. And on the order of 4 hours is optimal. These other technologies with which we have relatively little experience have much lower estimated costs of storing overnight energy, much higher costs of capacity, and because the costs of storing energy are relatively low, they are better suited for longer duration applications. We have a model that called GenX, or now OpenGenX, that we've developed, and in this study we do some simulations of what a deeply decarbonized system would look like in 2050, based on obviously a variety of assumptions. We look at 3 regions: Texas, the Southeast, the Northeast. The Northeast is New England and New York. And then we look at the model solves for the optimal mix of different generating technologies with different carbon emissions constraints. And the way our modeling works, it's as if there was a carbon emissions price of different levels consistent with these constraints. As you can see, with no limit, that is without any regulatory limits, we still get quite a bit of wind and solar in Texas without any regulatory requirements, and that's because the resources for those are very good. And we don't get that much in New England without pushing the system. We do get quite a bit of natural gas. As we tighten the carbon emissions constraint, we get more and more wind and solar, but we also begin to get storage entering the system to help to balance supply and demand. And just following on what Jacopo said, in the Southeast, we did a variety of experiments with nuclear, and existing nuclear is quite economical. In fact, it may be the most economical carbon reduction technology there is, but unless costs can be reduced, we're not getting new nuclear in our simulations, at least in the Southeast. We then introduce a variety of different technologies based on cost estimates that our engineering and science colleagues have put together. And the mix of these technologies changes. The dark brown was lithium ion in our base case, but longer duration storage becomes much more economical for dealing with the swings in generation from wind and solar. And this also has implications for costs. The less storage you have, the more you have to overbuild the wind and solar system to meet demand when there's a lot of cloud cover or very little wind. Turning to wholesale markets, I mentioned before that the marginal cost of the short-run marginal cost of generating with wind and solar is very low. It's close to zero once it's been installed. And so we also look at what the future price distributions are likely to be, and we focus on Texas. And these are the price distributions in 2018 and 2019. Most of the prices are between 5 and 50. As we get more and more wind and solar, there are more and more hours where wind and solar are on the margin. We get more and more hours when prices are close to zero, and more hours when prices are in fact very high. And this has implications, especially for financing new technologies, because some of the technologies in the least cost portfolio depend heavily on very, very high priced hours for their net revenues. And we know from experience in the wholesale markets around the country that these are the kinds of conditions in which these markets perform poorly, and which there are some political constraints that have been imposed, price caps and others. And I should note that the price cap in New England is $2,500, for example, but we let prices go to $50,000 in order to have a reliable system. But that requires that if we have, with tight constraints, if we have at least a little bit of gas generation on the system, all the net revenues are going to have to come from these very small number of high-priced hours, and that's going to create some challenges for wholesale market design to help to finance these investments. Okay, in terms of using storage efficiently, we discuss in our study what policies. Full participation in wholesale markets is going to be very, very important. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, has an order out there that requires that, but it's the compliance has been slow. We need better integration of wholesale markets with behind the meter storage, that is rooftop solar and distribution-based storage. They need to be integrated in a common system. As I said before, we have lots of experience with pump storage and lithium-ion batteries, but we really need more R&D and experience with the other technologies I mentioned earlier, because these longer duration technologies are going to be really important as we approach net zero. Let me turn now briefly to transmission. Transmission, one of the reasons why transmission is important is the best solar and wind resources are not in the same places as the best locations for traditional thermal generators. And they tend to be more remote from population centers or in areas where there isn't transmission infrastructure. So just for example, there's a lot of development of offshore wind along the East Coast from Massachusetts all the way down to North Carolina. Obviously, there's no transmission infrastructure out there. It's potentially attractive because it's close to demand centers, but we need to build a whole new transmission network. Solar resources are best in the South. And in order to take advantage of these, we need to access them, and that requires building new transmission facilities. And then we also have a lot of wind generation down the whole middle of the US, but it's pretty far from population centers further east in Chicago and in Cleveland, and accessing these wind generating facilities for use in these areas. Illinois has a commitment to be net zero by 2050, again, requires building additional transmission capacity. And in our study, we have some analysis of what the costs and benefits are of expanding transmission, especially interregional transmission, and it reduces costs. It actually reduces the need for storage because you can diversify both the supply of wind and solar and demand as time varies across the U.S. and as we expand the market areas of wholesale markets. Transmission faces a number of different barriers. I think the biggest barrier right now is we don't have a national accepted comprehensive decarbonization policy, so the states are going alone. But there are also institutional problems. We need to expand the scope of transmission planning. We need to expand the scope of benefits that we look at from transmission to not just being reliability, but taking account as well of reducing the cost of access to wind and the best wind and solar sites. And this can't be done on a project by project basis. As it's done now, it needs to be done on a portfolio basis. FERC Order 1000 encourages the system operators to rely more on competitive procurement of major new facilities to help to control costs, and that's also been slow to be implemented. But if we're going to expend all these resources, they should be the lowest cost possible. And then finally, the so-called NIMBY problems, permitting and stakeholder opposition to new lines. And I have a paper that discusses how we might go about dealing with this. We need to get more out of the existing system. it requires re-examination of reliability criteria, which are 70 years old in many cases, real-time line ratings with smart grid facilities, communications and control and monitoring facilities, more intensive use of existing rights of way so you don't bother so many people, use other existing rights of way, not just electric power rights of way, but railroads, canals, and highways, and incorporate underground and underwater routes where this is feasible. Then the permitting process is extremely complicated, and we really need to integrate it so that developers don't have to go to every municipality, every state, and the federal government to get approvals. And there's been some experience with consolidating approval process using independent mediators. I think most importantly, to share the benefits with all of the affected stakeholders along the way. I think one of the worst things that was done in New England to try to build transmission to increase hydroelectric imports from Quebec was to give the impression that the transmission lines were sort of extension cords between Quebec and Boston. And for the people in Maine and New Hampshire where these lines were going to go, were not convinced they were going to serve any benefits. And then finally, and this is something I think that hasn't gotten enough attention, is curbing any anti-competitive practices. Competitors inside the existing areas, the incumbents, don't like the competition from these new generation sources. And in some cases, they've made it very difficult for new transmission facilities to be approved. And just to give you an example, this is a transmission project that goes from Quebec down to New York City. It's been in development, I think it's 17 years. It has financing. It's mostly underwater or underground. It's gotten permits from most of the towns along the way during this period of time. It bypasses a very significant transmission constraint in this part of New York that keeps wind and hydro from coming to New York City. And it's still facing difficulties despite ticking off most of the boxes I had on the previous list. So this remains a challenge, and hopefully it's a challenge that people who are interested in decarbonization are going to begin to pay more attention to. And that's it. Thank you. I'll turn it back.
Thank you, Paul. That was an overview of an issue that has so many levels of depth and complexity that it's hard to wrap one's brain around. However, thank you for the start that has offered us. We do have a number of questions. Let me start with Jacopo. Someone is challenging you on your use of the term battery, since the device you are promoting does not store energy, and yet the concept of battery implies storage. Aren't you starting off behind the eight ball with your phraseology? Why'd you choose battery?
Well, I never heard that there is a requirement of energy storage for batteries. You could argue that the chemicals used in traditional electrochemical batteries is fuel, just the same way that uranium is fuel for a nuclear reactor. So I'm not too sympathetic to that comment. But in general, the reason why we call them batteries is multifold, primarily because they are small, plug and play installed, and as I said, interchangeable. So just as you have, AA, AAA, type D batteries, the idea is that a device needing electricity, and in this case, and or heat, does not have to deploy any specialized infrastructure, because the connections between that energy source and the system would be plug and play, just like traditional batteries. So that's the analogy, and we're thinking about that fleet model that I described earlier. We're not married to that name. It just seems to make a lot of sense, and we'll see how it pans out.
Another question in the same vein. Please discuss the disposal of radioactive waste in this model.
Right. So the just like traditional nuclear power plants, there is going to be some radioactive waste that is produced on a per unit energy generated, whether it's heat or electricity, is basically the same as the traditional plant. So the amounts are the same. The difference is that in this case, instead of storing that that material at the site, which is what we do now with the traditional plants, the system is shipped back to a centralized facility, and therefore you accumulate the the waste directly at a centralized site, and that's certainly an advantage for the eventual final repository or disposal, I should say, but also very importantly because the user sites are no longer basically sites where you have radioactive material. So again, we think that in that sense, this is a better deal, so to speak, also from the nuclear waste point of view.
Quote from one of our participants: "I have advocated for small or micro nuclear reactors for some time, but according to the En-ROADS, ENROADS, climate model, large-scale adoption of nuclear power makes very little difference to temperature rise and carbon emissions. Is this correct? Can you comment?"
Well, I'm not sure I completely understand the question. If the concern is about the so-called waste heat rejection to the environment and the impact that might have, the direct sort of heating up of the environment from a thermal plant, I think that's really negligible. Whether it's a thermal power plant that uses nuclear or gas or coal, but I'm not sure that that's what's meant. If the question is, can we use nuclear energy as part of a portfolio of energy sources to reduce the emissions and therefore have a positive impact on climate change, I think the IPCC, among many other studies at this point, shows that yes, it certainly can be part of the portfolio, and I would argue that it should be, assuming the cost is right, but also because it does provide that additional level of stability and reliability that back to Paul's presentation, the intermediate renewables cannot give you unless you deploy an enormous amount of transmission and storage.
Two complementary questions. Are any companies beginning to invest in nuclear batteries? And what is your best guess for a timeline for practical fielding of these?
Yeah, the answer to the first question is absolutely yes. And the first that we're going to probably see are for the US Army. There is a dedicated program called Pele program. The Army is interested in using these systems for operating bases and therefore eliminating the need for transporting diesel fuel to long distances. That program is set to make a down selection in technology basically this month, March, and then the first nuclear demonstration, not in the field, but at the Idaho National Lab, 2020, late 2023, early 2024, with a deployment in the field of 2026. On the commercial side, and by the way, the companies there are called BWXT and X Energy. For those of you who follow these things, maybe those names mean something. But on the commercial side, there are also several companies. The most credible, which is Westinghouse, which of course is a very well-known and established nuclear company with a business also in large reactors, but they've taken an interest 4 years ago in these microreactors, and their offering should be ready for a nuclear demonstration again at the Idaho National Lab, most likely in 2025, and then commercial with an NRC license in 2027. So the timelines are, by nuclear standards, are pretty aggressive, actually, well before the end of the decade, which is an additional reason why this is attractive compared to the traditional model. Because right now, if you just go out there in the US and ask someone, build me a large light water reactor at gigawatt scale, if you're lucky, 6-7 years, more likely over a decade. If you're lucky. Paul, I see you're chuckling because we know very well that the ongoing projects are not 5 or 6 years. So yeah.
Paul, the one question: are wind and solar energy dependent on tax incentives? And if not, how long has that been the case?
Well, I'm not sure they're dependent. They certainly benefit from investment tax credits and from production tax credits. But putting those aside, the cost of building these facilities has declined dramatically over the last over the last 10 years. And quite a few people have worked on this at MIT. And who knows in 2050 what kinds of tax credit regime or subsidy regime we'll have. So what we do in our study is we just look at a high cost, a low cost, or a medium cost to capture uncertainty about how costs will decline, but also uncertainty about what kinds of tax incentives there'll be.
One of our commenters, participants asks, Dr. Stephen Koonin is a former Undersecretary for Science and a former professor at Caltech. His book, Unsettled, makes the following statement, quote, "The net economic impact of human-induced climate change will be minimal through at least the end of this century. Do you believe," close quote. Do you believe this is an accurate statement? Paul?
It's really not my field. I mean, I think Steve is kind of out there on the fringe. I think most people think that the impacts will be significant before that, but our work just really tries to follow the policies and ask the question of if the policy is going to be to get to net zero by 2050, what does that mean in terms of technology costs and changes in the institutional environment?
Okay. Jacopo, one person asks, how do the nuclear power systems in aircraft carriers compare with your nuclear batteries? They sound
right. Let me unmute. And by the way, Zoom took me out for a minute, and I think it was an opportune time. I'm happy.
Whoops.
I didn't hear the answer, so maybe I'll ask you, Paul, your opinion on that one. But anyway, so getting to this question, how do they compare to what we use for propulsion, what the Navy uses for propulsion, either submarines or aircraft carriers? Different technologies, different sizes, different requirements. The Navy uses miniaturized versions of light water reactors or pressurized water reactors. So they're water cooled and they operate at a relatively low temperature. That's a technology has been used and established for many, many decades. These nuclear batteries, because the vision is that they would be deployed broadly in factories, cities, communities, etc. They really need to have a different safety profile. In other words, even under the worst possible scenario, you cannot have a release of radioactivity into the environment. And so that has driven the designs towards different materials, different fuels. So, but also operating at a higher temperature, which makes them attractive in terms of efficiency of conversion of heat to electricity, one. Number two, direct use of heat for industrial processes that, as I explained in the presentation, require heat. So very different. And just to give you examples, the coolant in some cases is not even circulating. You don't have a pump or a blower that actually moves the coolant around. It's a heat pipe. So you have a sealed pipe with a small amount of material within that evaporates at one end and condenses at the other end. So there are no moving parts inside the core. So there is a real push for reliability and sturdiness and robustness, given the again, the desire to deploy this in a distributed fashion.
Thank you. What is your sense of unit electricity cost from the nuclear battery system versus current large nuclear facilities feeding the power grids?
Yeah, the initial units will likely be significantly more expensive. I could quantify by how much, in my opinion. I actually published a paper that does sort of a bottom-up analysis of these batteries. But the factors here to keep in mind is that even those first units could be competitive because they're not competing against the grid, right? So you're not actually selling electricity on the grid, but you're selling either electricity or heat to a co-located user. So you're not competing against generation prices or cost on the grid. You're competing against whatever energy sources used at that particular site. If those sites are remote, they're not even connected to the grid, and very often they use diesel generators. So you're looking at a competition that is around $300 or plus per megawatt hour. And in those contexts, the nuclear batteries, the early nuclear batteries, are going to be quite competitive. As you start to fabricate more, deploy more, and the cost per unit per nuclear battery comes down, then you start to also penetrate larger markets. But that's going to take, that's obviously going to take a while.
Sure. If we had 100% electric vehicles, what would be the impact on the grid? Either of you have an opinion on that matter?
Yes, it's going to increase the demand for electricity rather significantly, and also require reinforcement of the distribution systems to handle the charging load. We actually, in our work, we've actually built in assumptions about transportation electrification and building electrification, some electrification in other sectors, and the demand increases on the order of 50%. So it's a non-trivial effect on electricity demand.
Yeah, that's consistent with my estimates, about 250 gigawatt average, right? Which is roughly half of our current grid. So that's massive, really. Yeah.
That would require a significant rethinking of the entire grid. Thank you. Yes. I've noticed that these and other MIT EI presentations that enhanced geothermal systems have hardly been mentioned, if at all, since Jeff Tester's 2006 Future of Geothermal Energy report, whereas activity is ramping up at other campuses, notably University of Texas at Austin. I am curious why enhanced geothermal systems is not within the MIT EI portfolio. Paul?
I knew Jeff Tester pretty well. He was known as Hot Rocks Tester, and he had a research portfolio. But these are decisions that are made by the departments as to what kinds of faculty and research staff they want to hire. It's not a decision that's made centrally, and certainly not by the economics department where my appointment is. So this must be a decision that was made in one of the engineering departments not to emphasize that area.
Okay. Jacopo, how do these storage concepts relate to small scale, single buildings, neighborhoods, small towns?
Yeah, great question. It depends on the output, and it depends on the on the demand for those applications. Obviously, the output, as I mentioned, is roughly, let's say, between 1 megawatt to maybe 10 megawatts or 20 megawatts, depends on the design, and the demand could be. There are many applications that are within that range. Let's see if I can be a little bit more specific. I mean, roughly speaking, a megawatt serves about maybe 600, 700 people in the United States in terms of electricity, needs. We did a study for the state of Washington a couple of years ago, and we were looking at heat applications in industrial sites. And we identified about 150 industrial sites just within the state of Washington that require almost on a continuous basis between 5 and 20 megawatts of heat. And so for those sites, it would be ideal to have these nuclear batteries there, and they could basically run all the time, which is good, I would say, required for good economics.
That is a fascinating sense that maybe there really is a complementarity there in terms of what the need and what this technology could deliver, which sounds like it could be a good solution. We have come more or less to the end. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. Do either Paul or Jacopo, would you like to make any closing comments?
No, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Jacopo? I'm getting a freeze there, so I'm going to pass on Jacopo's ability to communicate. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I think we've all learned something that was insightful. The issues are complex, but I see some interesting technologies that really could represent a better future ahead. So thank you very much for your participation, and look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you and goodbye.
Thanks for joining us. And for more information on how to connect with the MIT Alumni Association, please visit our website.